Hello, and welcome back to Thecrimereel. As a nod to Valentine's Day this week, our story looks at the troubled love story of BURT PUGACH and Linda RISS. On the 20th of April 1927, Paul and Anna PUGACH welcomed their second child, a boy who they named Bert. Bert grew up in a poor household with both of his parents and his older brother. They lived in an area of the Bronx in New York known as Corona Park North. His mother, Anna, felt he was incapable of doing things for himself and controlled many aspects of his life, even bathing him until he was 12 years old. She would often become frustrated with what she perceived to be his lack of ability and beat him. He would cry for his father, as when his father was at home, the beatings did not take place. In 1940, Bert felt humiliated by the fact that his parents arranged his bar mitzvah in a small local Chinese restaurant. Shortly before the event took place, his father, Paul, deserted the family. Bert's poor, unhappy childhood continued, but despite his mother's lack of faith in him, he was actually a bright child and graduated from the local high school in the top 5% of the year group. He went on to complete studies in both business and law and graduated with distinction from Brooklyn Law School in January 1950. Bert was accepted to the New York State Bar later that year and together with his friend Herb Whites forms Whites and Pugach. Within 5 years their law firm had become incredibly successful. Bert was earning from $40,000 to $80,000 a year at a time when the average annual wage was just $4,000. He invested in a nightclub, owned multiple cars, and even bought a small aeroplane. On February 23, 1937, when Bert was 10 years old, over in East Bronx, Oscar and Bertha RISS have a baby who they name Linda Eleanor. In 1942, when Linda was 5 years old, her parents divorced. Linda's mother struggled to look after her alone, so Linda was sent to live with her aunt and cousins. 7 years later, at the age of 12, Linda contracted rheumatic fever and was sent back to live with her mother and grandmother. Linda lacked any male role models in her life, and this, together with the lack of stability in her home life, unsettled Linda, and although she acted quite tough, she lacked self-confidence. Linda grew into a beautiful young lady who was always dressed and styled immaculately. Many compared her to Elizabeth Taylor, and she soon attracted the attention of many of the local boys. However, she always kept them at arm's length. In 1957, at the ages of 30 and 20 respectively, Bert and Linda met for the first time. Bert had just returned from London and was driving with a friend when he saw Linda walking along the street. He quickly parked the car as he felt he just had to talk to her. After a short conversation, Linda told Bert her telephone number and went on with her day. She later claimed that she had only given her number to this slightly older, not particularly attractive man to get rid of him, as she didn't feel that they were on the same wavelength. Shortly after she returned home, Linda received a dozen red roses from Bert. Bert claimed it was love at first sight. He called her to check that she had received the flowers and asked her out for a drink. A couple of days later, he took her on another date, this time in his plane. Both Linda and her family felt that he was an impressive, professional man, and Linda and Bert soon fell into a life of glamorous dates. Bert would shower Linda with affection and introduce her to a world that she had never seen before. He took her to meet his famous friends, collect her for dates in an expensive convertible car, take her to the nightclub, which he owned, where she would be treated like a superstar. Even to the point that when she arrived each evening, the band would immediately play the song Linda. The relationship became very intense very quickly. Burt would pick her up each morning and take her to breakfast and then on to work. He would meet her for lunch each day and then pick her up after work before taking her out for the evening. Compared to the boys of her own age, who simply fawned over her good looks, Linda was so impressed with the mature and sophisticated lifestyle that Burt offered her. For those around them, it was clear that Burt was head over heels in love with Linda, and that Linda was impressed with Burt, but whether this had developed into love was questionable. Burt continued to make a lot of money from his law firm. He was a negligence attorney. He would find clients who had been injured in accidents and fight for compensation on their behalf. It is alleged that at this time he would find a friendly doctor to write a report on the injured person, which would ultimately result in the injured receiving a payout. During the time when he was dating Linda, and unknown to her, he would often sleep with his clients. Linda did not believe in sex before marriage, and therefore in some way Burt felt that his infidelity was justified. Burt and Linda's fantastic dates continued, but soon Linda's grandmother became suspicious as to why this rich, successful, charming man in his 30s hadn't already found a wife. Eventually, Burt found out about the grandmother's suspicions and went out on a date with Linda, decided that he needed to tell her the truth. The truth was, he was in fact married to a woman named Francine. Burt and Francine had got married in 1951, 6 years before he had met Linda. Burt also had a severely ill daughter called Karin, who had been born in 1954. Burt explained to Linda that he had never truly wanted to marry Francine and the relationship had long since been over. Linda was devastated and immediately broke off her relationship with Burt, despite him pleading with her that his marriage was over and his divorce would be legalised imminently. The very next day, Burt contacted Linda to say that his divorce papers had luckily arrived. She was wary because of his lies. Linda asked to see them and visited him at his law offices. Burt produced documents to show that he was now officially divorced and that he and Linda could once again be a couple. Linda wanted to believe him, but still had her doubts, particularly in view of the fortuitous timing of the paper's arrival. She took a note of the divorce number, and her mother decided that she would get a lawyer to check that it was all above board. Back in the 1950s, this research would take considerably longer than it would today, so Linda decided that she would give Burt the benefit of the doubt and their relationship once again resumed. Before long, they were making plans for the future, house hunting, looking to buy a boat, and even starting to make wedding lists. However, Burt and Linda's differing view of sex before marriage became a constant battleground for them. Burt started to increasingly pressurise Linda, believing that with everything he gave and did for her, it was the least she could do for him. However, Linda stood firm. Burt started to accuse her of having sex with other men, and even made Linda visit a doctor to confirm her virginity. Around the same time, Burt's professional life was starting to descend into chaos. Questions had long since hung over the firm as to the legality and ethics of their practice, and Burt discovered that Whites and Pugach were being investigated by the Bar Association. Burt got caught in a downward spiral and started to drink heavily. His relationship with Linda had started to deteriorate, and when Linda's mother found that the divorce papers that Burt had shown her daughter were fake, Linda ended the relationship. A few weeks later, a close friend of Linda's was travelling to Florida with her family for a month-long vacation, and on a whim, Linda quit her job and decided to join them. At the beach one day, she met a handsome young man called Larry Schwartz. They made a stunningly beautiful couple and went on several dates. Linda was smitten with Larry, but the relationship was short-lived as Larry soon left with the army. Linda returned to New York, and Burt continuously begged her to take him back. Linda resisted for a while, but eventually started dating Burt again, as he promised he would marry her soon. However, he kept making excuses to avoid booking the wedding, and when his wife Francine contacted Linda, it was the final straw. Francine told Linda that she knew all about her and that she would never grant Burt with a divorce. In September 1958, Linda decided that it was over for good. Burt took the news extremely badly. He was found crying on his office floor, became increasingly depressed and began drinking even more. Then, in November 1958, the New York bar charged Whites and Pugach with illegal fee splitting in order to obtain cases. Around the same time, Linda started dating Larry Schwartz again after he returned from the army. This dragged Burt further into his depression. At a party, he became so agitated that he was threatening to kill himself. Burt was taken to a local psychiatric hospital but discharged when a friend arrived to collect him. Burt became obsessed and relentless in his quest to get Linda back. At the end of 1958 and start of 1959, his behaviour became increasingly erratic and threatening towards Linda. He was desperate to win her back on any terms. He hired people to throw rocks at Linda's house in order to scare her so that she would feel safer being with him. Linda reported this to the local police, but they did not press charges. Burt continued to harass Linda at work, and she eventually lost her job because of all the disruption he had caused. Linda tried again to report this to the police, but once again they decided not to take any action. Larry continued to support Linda throughout this time. He was a very different person to Burt. He was laid back and kind. He drove a station wagon, and whilst he did not have the means to spoil Linda in the way that Burt did, she was absolutely enchanted by him. On 24th of May 1959, Linda and Larry got engaged. When Burt found out, he lost his temper completely. He hid in the shadows of the porch at Linda's house, waiting for Linda and Larry to return from their evening out. He had a gun and was intent on killing Larry. However, when Linda and Larry arrived home and saw Burt waiting for them, Burt realised he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger and fled the scene. A couple of weeks later, on June 14th, 1959, Linda and Larry and their families had a party to celebrate their engagement. They were both happy and in love, surrounded by those closest to them. The next morning there was a knock at the front door. Linda was getting dressed and fixing her hair as she opened the door. A man posing as a delivery man was standing there, and Linda assumed that there was a package being delivered, possibly an engagement gift following her celebrations the previous evening. As she opened the door with her mother standing just behind her, the delivery man wedged his foot in the doorway and threw a substance called lye directly into Linda's face. Lye, spelled L-Y-E, is a very caustic chemical that can burn through living tissue. It immediately started to burn Linda's face and she rushed to the bathroom, putting her face under the tap, but soon passed out. Her mother and grandmother called an ambulance and Linda was rushed to the Medical Arts Center Hospital in New York. Doctors told Linda that she would have a difficult period of recovery ahead of her and predicted that she would lose all of her sight and be permanently scarred from the attack. The police visited Linda in hospital, where she again informed them about Burt's threatening behaviour. The attack became a huge news story and made headlines nationwide. When Larry visited Linda in hospital, she told him that he should leave her, that this wasn't the life that he expected, and that she was worried that he would be the next one to get hurt. Larry stood by Linda and visited her regularly at the hospital, where Linda remained under 24-hour police protection. Eventually, after remaining in hospital for more than 3 months and undergoing several operations, Linda was discharged in September 1959. She retained a small amount of sight, but had been warned that this would deteriorate further over time. Meanwhile, the police were continuing to build a case against Burt. He was still trying to make contact with Linda through phone calls and sending flowers despite her police protection. 1 month after Linda was released from hospital, on October the 30th, 1959, Burt was arrested along with the men that he had hired to attack Linda. Burt's bail was set at over $100,000. At the time, that was the highest amount ever set in a Bronx criminal case. Once the press interest had calmed down and a new reality had set in for Linda, Larry called off their engagement. Linda remained under police protection and Burt was tried in July 1961. He was found guilty and after numerous psychiatric evaluations received the maximum sentence of 15 to 30 years in state prison. He maintained that he never intended for the lie attack and he had simply hired the men to beat Linda up a little so that she would be scared and turn to him for protection. Whilst happy with the sentence, Linda felt that 30 years still wasn't long enough for what Burt had done. She decided she needed to move on and make a life of her own. She got her own apartment and went to work every day. She grabbed opportunities to try new things and despite her limited sight took up painting and travelled extensively in Europe. It was a time that she remembers as one of the happiest in her life. She would spend lots of money on expensive dark glasses which hid her scarring and she was rarely seen without them. When Linda returned to New York from her travels, she started to date a new man and they soon fell deeply in love. He was completely smitten with her and wanted to meet her parents and marry her. Linda didn't know what to do as he had never seen her without her dark glasses. After discussing it with her friends, she decided that the next time she saw him, she would wear her clear glasses as she needed him to see her as she really was. When he arrived to take her out, seeing her without the protection of her dark glasses, he withdrew. It was more than he could handle and he immediately broke off their relationship. His reaction destroyed Linda. She decided that she was damaged merchandise and would never reveal herself without her dark glasses again. Linda's world became smaller. She was living alone in New York and started to go out less and less. Her vision had deteriorated still further. Her grandmother had died and her mother was suffering with dementia. Burt constantly tried to contact her from prison, meaning that Linda had to change her telephone number multiple times. Burt also managed to earn money providing legal advice to other convicts while he was in prison, and he sent this money to Linda. In early 1974, Burt was eligible for parole, and Linda wrote to the parole board requesting that he was not freed as he was still managing to harass her from inside the prison. Despite this, Burt was released on parole on 21st of March 1974. He had served 14 years in prison. Unable to practice law, Burt started working as a paralegal in Queens, and part of his parole conditions meant that he was not allowed to make contact with Linda. With Burt's release, details of the case became newsworthy again. Burt completed a TV interview where he decided to talk to Linda through the camera. He declared his undying love for her and then proposed to her on national TV. With all of this renewed interest, Linda's life suddenly became more interesting again. At a girls' night shortly after the TV interview, Linda and her friends were discussing their love lives. Linda became withdrawn as she had no one and her life felt very bleak. She was 35 years old and felt that she did not have a future to be excited about. Seeing her distress and her obviously conflicting emotions about Burt, her friends decided to arrange for Burt and Linda to meet so that they could finally confront each other. Despite everything that had happened, after this initial meeting, Linda and Burt started dating again. Surprisingly, just a few months later, on the 27th of November 1974, they were married at the Kew Gardens Court building in Queens. Burt claimed that despite her injuries, the ones that he had inflicted, Linda was still as beautiful as ever, whilst Linda declared that jail had made a new man of Burt. Despite an additional charge in 1996 of threatening a woman with whom he was having an affair, a charge which Burt represented himself against and managed to get himself acquitted, Linda and Burt stayed married for 38 years until her death of heart failure on the 22nd of January 2013. During their marriage they would constantly bicker, but Burt would generally be at her beck and call, particularly when she lost her remaining eyesight in 1990. Linda felt that he was a good husband, looking after her, taking care of her medicines and giving her financial security, referring to him as her best buddy. Burt always maintained that he loved her deeply, that his actions were a crime of passion and that he would undo the events of 15th of June 1959 if he possibly could. In an interview during the course of their marriage, Linda was quoted as saying that being with me is not an easy thing, and how she figured this was the best revenge, that Burt would have to look at the consequences of his actions every day he was with her. Whether she made the best of the circumstances that had been forced upon her and forgave Burt in order to achieve this while punishing for his actions, or if she was ultimately a controlled victim until her dying day, we will never know. However, in her later years, she was quoted as saying, "It's Burt and I against the world, so we can only hope that she found happiness in the most unusual of love stories." That concludes the story of BURT PUGACH and Linda RISS. I hope you found that story interesting. Have you got any Valentine's Day stories that you'd like to share on the comments? If you want to know more about this, there is a film that was made in 2007 called Crazy Love. Thanks very much for listening again to Thecrimereel. Goodbye. Did you know, under the settings on these videos, you can vary the speed so that for listening to any audio, if it's too slow or too fast, you can click on there and you can change the speed of the recording. There you go. I only found that out the other day. Thank you very much once again for listening. Goodbye.